I was born in Budapest, Hungary. Really wasn't all that different. It was just certain things you wouldn't say in public. But as a kid, I didn't really notice any of that. We left Hungary when I was 12, and we had to wait 2 years in Austria before we could move to the United States. And in Austria, I took English lessons, but it's really not enough to prepare you to the full immersion that you get when you move to a new country. In Hungary, I did a little bit of Taekwondo, sort of like kids do here, where you like to wear the uniforms and get the belts and all that. And my father had been a boxer when he was younger, so he taught me a little bit of boxing, but not too much, and I never competed in boxing or anything like that. And when we moved to the United States, they tried to adjust us and kind of put us into sports and in the classes that we would take in school and all that. And they tried to put me in basketball because I was tall for my age, but I never liked basketball. And then they wanted to put me into wrestling, and I didn't like wrestling, but I tried it, and I sort of I don't know, I guess I picked it up easy. It was kind of a natural at it, so that's why I got to like wrestling. It wasn't because it wasn't by choice. It was sort of, I kind of fell into it. I wrestled a couple of years in college, and then I dislocated my shoulder, and I quit wrestling. I had competed in judo actually, a little bit just for fun, but that was something I did on the side while I was wrestling. And I had tried jiu-jitsu, also same principle, just kind of on the side of wrestling. And then after I quit wrestling, I was working in the high-tech industry, and I couldn't just sit on my butt. I had to get back into some sort of competition, so I went down to the nearest place, which happened to be the American Kickboxing Academy. And there I signed up for jiu-jitsu lessons, and then they talked me into fighting, and I believe wrestling is more physically intense than MMA. It's just that MMA has a lot more impact to them that wrestling doesn't, but physically I think wrestling is more of a stress on your body. Mentally, you have that same kind of rush before a contest, but you have to sort of come to terms with the fact that you're going to get hit, which is an experience that some people deal with better than others. And that was kind of I remember my first fight, it was the biggest high of my life. I mean, I went out, that was in Hawaii, and it ended in like a minute and 20 seconds or something like that. I just took the guy down and I pounded him until the ref pulled me off. And I had so much adrenaline that I had to go outside and do sprints just to work off the extra energy after the fight. So, that was a rush, and I was hooked on that. But I was never a fighter outside of the sport. I didn't get into too many, fights as a kid. I was a street fighter. I didn't walk around with a chip on my shoulder trying to bump into people or act like a bully or anything like that. But I don't know, I think there's always something where I just wanted to prove things to myself, to see if I could do things. And that was really what motivated me for MMA, I think. Because I thought of it as the ultimate challenge, sort of to test myself, not because I wanted to beat up the other guy, but just because I wanted to see if it's something that I can do. The stakes are really high, and there's really no margin for error. So if you're wasting your energy on something else like anger or hatred or whatever you might want to call it, you're really not focusing on your job, which is to, within the rules of the sport, find a way to win, whether that's a knockout or a submission or whatever else it might be. So I think it's just about concentration, and part of it is showmanship, part of it is trying to psych out your opponent. So I would always try to gauge my opponent's mental state by looking them right in the eye as they come out to the cage, and see if they look at me, see if they don't, see if they are intimidated, or see if there's anything they give me that I can use. Because ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're imposing your will on your opponent. My last fight was in the UFC. I had been fighting in the UFC for a few years at that time. And I had a fight that I thought I won, but it was a split decision loss. And I actually didn't feel too bad about it because I thought I did my job. as I had expected, the UFC cut me, and I told myself when I got into the sport, I said, okay, I'm going to see how far I can take this, but I'm not going to take a step backwards. Also at that time, what happened was my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and I moved home to help her, so that prevented me training or anything like that. It was within a year she passed away, and I had taken so much time off, and by that time, I don't know if I could have gone back in and, competed at the same level, so I didn't really have the motivation to do so either, so I was I was battling, the healthcare system and the red tape because she didn't have insurance, and it was really just a really depressing time of my life. So it was probably better for me not to get back in the ring. I still have a lot of friends involved in the sport, so I watch their fights, and usually when I do get that urge that I want to get back in there and fight. And I remember how much fun it was to do that. And then the next thought is remembering all the pain and heartache and incredibly hard work that goes into being a fighter and all the sacrifices. Essentially, when I was training for a fight, I was training 2 or 3 times a day. You get up, you train, you eat, you sleep. You get up a few hours later, train again, eat, sleep. There's nothing that you do except eat, sleep, train, which is fine when you're doing that and you're motivated to do it, and it's not really a complaint about that, except that I can't sacrifice all the other things I'm doing now. So yeah, I do get that urge and think, oh, wouldn't it be great to get back into the sport? But the rational side of my brain jumps in and cuts me off before I get too far with that line of thinking. I do love to get back in there and roll. I generally don't want to spar anymore because I don't want to get in the head too much anymore. And I also think that's something that's very important for the guys to consider, because head trauma is real and it usually happens in practice. I think it's great that MMA has become more mainstream and it's not so shocking to people anymore, but at the same time maybe we've forgotten about some of the risks and the dangers involved in the sport. And I think people, especially kids who want to get into this sport, should really take a second look at all that data, because I think it's only a matter of time until you see evidence of this type of head trauma with, ringing in the ears, depression, cognitive skills being messed up, memory loss, that type of stuff. This isn't child's play. This is a rough sport. It's a tough way to make a living. The brain damage and the head trauma is something that people should think about, because you do not notice it when it happens. I'll give one example. One time, way back when I was sparring a little too much perhaps, I used to work at this bar downtown, and I had a clock-in number, which is 803. I still know it, because every day I would clock in 803. But after a couple of sparring sessions, maybe I had taken too many hits to the head. I didn't notice this, but I could not log in because I didn't remember my number. Now, this is not hard evidence of anything, but I'm thinking perhaps a little too much sparring might have had something to do with it. I happened to notice that because there's this thing that I had to do, which is clock in, and it was 803, and that was my number. But how many times do these things happen where people don't even notice that you're taking on brain damage, and the effects of that you're going to feel years down the line. So I think that's something that people should worry about or take precautions against. And the only reason why I went to college was for wrestling. That was my only motivation. No one in my family graduated from college. So when I got hurt and I quit wrestling, I had no more reason to be in college, and I dropped out. And that's when I got into the high-tech industry as a network engineer, and I kind of taught myself, and I earned some certifications like Cisco Certified Network Professional and things like that. And I got a job, and then I said, okay, maybe I should finish up my degree. But when I was in school, I didn't really have any motivation to study, so nothing really appealed to me. Nonetheless, I decided to enroll through Open University at San Jose State, and I took a philosophy class, and it immediately clicked. It was social and political philosophy, and the topic was, in general, it was justice, and that was something that has always appealed to me. I always had a sense of honor and justice and the right things to do. So thereafter, I took all the philosophy courses to get my degree, and I got pretty much A's and maybe a couple of B's in all of them. And then I went on to law school, and throughout that time I was fighting. I earned my law degree. I had my first fight in the UFC while I was a second-year law student, and I kept fighting after I graduated from law school and passed the bar exam. And after that, I also went back to school while I was fighting and earned my master's in philosophy. And I now teach philosophy at San Jose State, and I also practice law, and I teach ethics, moral issues. So I sort of, I guess the one thing that appears in all of those is this concept of fairness that appears in fighting itself, because I think more so than any other sport, it has an element of fairness in that we have weight classes and we try to match up people who are the same size with the same rules, no teammates to blame or count on or anything like that. And, it's a fair fight. It's the same thing in a courtroom. It's the same thing in the legal system. You try to make it a fair fight and determine the winner based on rules. While I was fighting, I came up with a logo that I wore on my shorts, which was my idea, and I had an artist sort of come up with the actual logo itself. But it was certified organic fighter is what it said, and it says 100%. The idea being that it's just like beef or whatever you buy at the store. It's certified organic, meaning that I would volunteer for any kind of test as far as performance-enhancing drugs, because if you don't have anything to hide, why wouldn't you? And I didn't, and I made it a point to let everybody know that some athletes who compete at the highest levels of the sport are natural, because every time you hear about these things, you only hear about the scandals of somebody getting popped with steroids or growth hormone or whatever it might be. So I started later on, when I retired, I started a nonprofit organization to try to recognize athletes who are willing to live by a certain standard and say, okay, here, take my blood, test it, do whatever you want, and volunteer for that, and promote the idea that, hey, you can achieve success without drugs. There needs to be a voice for fighters collectively somehow, because I believe that fighters are in an unequal bargaining position as compared to promoters in general. But of course, essentially there's one promoter who controls the elite level of the market, and I think that's a necessity. And so the third thing would be that in MMA, I think addressing things like retirement and insurance and things like that for fighters is also something that requires some sort of an entity to speak on behalf of fighters. So I'm hoping that with the rise of the sport, and I congratulate the UFC for all that they do, because I think they produce a great product, but they're obviously first and foremost concerned about making money for themselves and essentially off the fighters' backs. Now, to a kid who has never made a significant amount of money, to get paid $10,000 is a great deal of money. But when you're risking what you are risking in the sport, and you're giving up opportunities to finish your college degree, to earn a career in a field where you can work for the rest of your life and retire, and you're risking brain damage and cognitive damage and whatever else that's going to prevent you from working in the future, you need to make that money to retire on. Now, that's not going to be $1 million. You can't retire on $1 million. That's going to be more than that. Granted, not everybody's going to make that kind of money, but when you get to that point, to see if this is a career for you where you can keep fighting for years and keep taking those risks, you should accumulate that kind of money to retire on, because your career is not going to last too much longer than 5 years anyway. There are the exceptions, but every time you go out there, you risk injury, you risk ending your career, and you're making money for somebody else. You're making money for the promoters, for everybody else involved in the sport. I believe the fighters are the product, so they are the bosses, and the promoters work for the fighters, not the other way around. And right now the industry is set up as the promoters are the bosses and they get to dictate the terms to the fighters. I believe that's wrong, and I think with a little bit of solidarity, getting the fighters together to agree as far as what sort of contracts they're going to agree to and what sort of contract they're not going to agree to, this could be changed.